this is the beginning of a conversation about serving vulnerable children in California. As all of you know, LCFF LCAP, the historic legislation that was signed in July of 2013, is a remarkable accomplishment because it gets to equity without a long-term legal battle. Most other states have had lawsuits that result in getting greater support to kids. California was able to do this without that long-term battle in the courts, and that should be acknowledged. What we are doing in exchange for more resources for kids who are poor, learning English, and in foster care, we're asking districts to do at least two things. We're asking districts to be more transparent about how resources are spent, and we're asking districts to engage in greater levels of engagement with stakeholders. And that becomes incredibly important as we look for ways to better serve these youngsters. Our little wristbands at the CCEE say, CCEE, the right kind of help, would suggest that there was a period of time in California where perhaps we, along with the rest of the country, emphasized the wrong kind of help. We are all about continuous improvement and building the capacity of our schools and districts to do better. A process that requires much, much greater engagement than clipboard compliance. The most gratifying thing that I do is not heading up the CCEE. The most gratifying thing that I do, I volunteer in a first grade class at Colin Powell School on the North Long Beach-Compton border. And in that class, you have a hardworking veteran teacher and 30 unduplicated pupils. And those youngsters, the teacher and I refer to them as the cherubs because they are absolutely cherubic. And they bring an amazing amount of hope for the future to that classroom. I am always amazed at what happens between the last week in August and June to educate youngsters the right way, to get them the right kind of help. I ended up volunteering in this class. That teacher was a 20-something-year-old junior secretary in the superintendent's office back when. And one day she said, "Do you think I could become a teacher?" And I said, "Of course you can." And she said, "If I become a teacher, would you volunteer in my class?" So that's what I've been doing for 20 plus years. And it keeps me focused. We have assembled an outstanding panel of folks with diverse backgrounds. They are Russ Rumberger, Vinnie Pompei, Margie McHugh, and Kyla Johnson-Trammell. I'm going to turn to Kyla first. Kyla, 25 years ago, I was sitting where you are. I was the brand spanking new superintendent of schools in Long Beach, an insider, a native son of Long Beach, I was appointed 2 months after the Rodney King riots. I had a boatload of challenges in front of me, but I also had a community that was very hopeful about my appointment. The fact that someone who was actually born and raised in Long Beach was now the superintendent of schools. You're in that situation. Tell us, are you hopeful? You've been at this for a couple months. What are the challenges, and what are you going to do about them?
Can you hear me? Perfect. What a great morning question. Good morning, everybody. I'm an eternal optimist. I don't think there's a way you can take a job like this without having that sort of attitude. But absolutely, there are lots of challenges, but lots of opportunities. And one of the ways that I try to keep my optimism is by being in schools every week, so that I can actually see up close and personal, talking to students, talking to teachers, talking to principals, talking to staff, what is going on, where the challenges are, but where the opportunities are. I think one thing that I've communicated to our community is staying on the course of our mission, which is being a full-service community district. That's been a mission that we've been on for about 6 years, and you can see some of the hope and some of the success in doing that, in bridging community-based organizations, bridging corporation partners, bridging our parents, and all of the folks working within the schools. We have become a sanctuary district. Our board passed that policy last year, and so our English language multilingual office has been increasing and growing in that capacity, where using our funds from the local control funding formula, really working to support our newcomer population that now is at 7%. And so working with our schools to really figure out how are we supporting, that's one of our students that I would say is vulnerable. I like to call our students who bring to schools all of the challenges at promise, because they're all brilliant and just need more of our support. So that's something that we're working into the fabric of some of the things that we've already been doing. We've seen a lot of reduction in our suspensions, mainly because some of the work that we've been doing with our African American Male Achievement Office, which we have now expanded for our Latino students and Asian Pacific Islanders. So continuing some of those partnerships, really working to push the mindset of our adults, really working to improve the relationships between adults and students in our schools. The notion that Pedro Noguera brought forth earlier, collective agency, working to promote teacher leadership in schools, and continuing to focus on teacher retention and principal retention, as in many urban districts, our schools that have the highest percentage of vulnerable youth have the highest percentage of teacher attrition. So we know in our urban schools, really using our dollars more effectively to have strategies, knowing the teacher shortage we have in California, is important to have stronger teacher quality in order to make sure that students are getting what they need. I was very involved in the LCAP in my former role, and I think part of the challenge and also the blessing is having so much input from students, from parents, really pushing on us in a good way to be more strategic with how we're using the funds, which I think is a huge challenge for us. You see so much need, and I think from a financial perspective, the gut is to try to invest in everything. And when you invest in everything, the impact then becomes very small. And so part of our work moving forward, knowing our own challenges within our district around waning resources, and knowing that in California, really our base funding is still insufficient. And so it becomes very challenging to use the supplemental and concentration funds purely to do some of the work for our students who are most challenged. So the push from community for us, which is a good one, is to be more strategic, to really be clear, what are those high leverage strategies that we're going to work on so we have a stronger return on an investment? So I think that is the work moving forward, is really being clear where we're focusing our attention and people really looking at our LCAP and looking at how we're spending those dollars in a way that's going to have a stronger return on investment for our students. So definitely always hopeful, but there are definitely lots of challenges as well.
And what is it about growing up in East Oakland that makes you better prepared than maybe some hotshot from elsewhere?
I would say, if anything, relationships and knowing the environment, knowing many of the schools, having been a teacher myself, having been a principal myself, and actually starting off my teaching career a block above where I actually grew up in East Oakland. So really being able to take some of the theory and take the concepts and connect that to the reality of what's going on. I think it just reminds me the importance of listening. My grandmother always told me, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. I think that's an important aspect of being a leader. The more complicated the challenges, the more important it is to listen. My dad always told me if it was that easy, it would have been fixed already. So I am humbled knowing that the challenges that I'm walking into in any superintendent of any urban district, they're challenges that have been here for a while. It's going to take collective community input. And so being able to use some of the relationships that I have and the learning to move us forward.
Thank you. Margie McHugh is the director of the Migration Policy Institute at the National Center on Immigration Integration Policy. Margie, what's it like for kids and families living in fear? What does fear do to them? I was talking to the people out in the office in Indio, where I'm located, who head up migrant education, and they were talking about this issue of fear that just seems to permeate what families are struggling with. How do you address that?
Well, I would say that for a long time, I would say that when immigrant communities were, when schools looked at the fear that immigrant communities often had about attending school, there was an attitude of, oh, you have nothing to worry about. We have Plyler v. Doe as a bedrock civil rights protection in terms of the access that children have to school, the fact that schools are safe places for children to attend and the like. But having had a presidential election where there was such heated not just rhetoric, but also a series of policies that were harped on time and time again, talking about, particularly with now President Trump, the idea that all unauthorized individuals would be deported, would be targets for enforcement under his administration, that there would be increases in the number of immigration and customs enforcement agents, a wall built along the Mexican border, et cetera. And then, of course, also the promise to ban Syrians from entering, to have a travel ban more generally and more extreme vetting for individuals from primarily Muslim origin countries, that it became an atmosphere that created a tremendous amount of fear. But then immediately when the president came into office, many of his top policies that he very proudly announced had to do with implementing many of those campaign promises. It was the one thing I would say that the administration was poised to do, because they had very close cooperation with Senator Jeff Sessions, who then was appointed the Attorney General by the president, and then the chief aide to Senator Sessions, who had worked for years to promote a restrictionist agenda in the Senate, became a top aide to the president. And so we've all probably heard of how many positions are unfilled in many parts of the federal government, but that is not the case when it comes to a lot of the immigration-related provisions. They were very, very ready to implement a lot of those. And so I would say that now it's fear because of the changed reality. It's not just a change in the atmospherics around immigration policy, but because now there is not the same prioritization of individuals for deportation. A lot of the careful work that was done both in the Obama administration and even which to a certain extent existed during the Bush years, where enforcement resources, deportation resources, were prioritized to address those who had committed crimes and were therefore a target for deportation. Now that's become much, much looser, and so it's very palpable in local communities that they're really at any minute that family members could be taken away. And of course, this is an enormous challenge for schools. It's why there are a number of, I think, terrific panels set up later in the day to try and talk about what I would say is it's no longer about creating a welcoming environment or talking with families about the safety that they have in terms of attending school, for example, but really that there's true supports now, a different type of supports that immigrant and refugee families need because there's so much danger that they face and the fear that schools could become more and more implicated potentially, which for the most, in enforcement efforts, for the most case, that's not, in most cases that would not be true, but there are some lines that families are very worried about.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I should say that Professor Noguera talked about the impact of traumatic stress and the like, and obviously I actually do a lot of work in the early childhood field where there's a very big focus on trauma-informed care, and I'm sorry to say that most of that work related to trauma-informed care is not really embracing the experience of immigrant families. I would say in states like California, in the K-12 context, more and more there is that thinking in terms of the anxiety, the trauma, what it does to students and families' willingness to even come forward to schools and for services, but then also the ability of children to learn when they're facing such anxiety and stress about the safety of their families.
Vinnie Pompei, you run the Youth Wellbeing Project for the Human Rights Campaign, whose goal is to promote inclusion and well-being for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth. I read an NPR story about your life and career. You have a passion for this, you've lived it, you've experienced it. What can you tell us about how schools can better protect youngsters?
Thank you. It sounds like my mic is on. So my name is Vinnie Pompei. Thank you. Use he, him, his pronouns. And I'd like to just thank everyone from EdSource that invited us here, and it's including LGBT as part of this important discussion. Currently, LGBT young people across the country and right here in California, even in some of the most liberal, open-minded communities, are struggling. They're struggling because they're being bullied and harassed by peers. They're struggling because they fear that their families might learn about their sexual orientation or gender identity and reject them and even kick them out, leaving them with no place to go. They are frustrated and concerned and stressed that the schools that they attend are not creating spaces where they can be themselves and that they feel protected and seen for who they are. And that's leaving some really disturbing statistics out there that we know of. The CDC just recently launched their annual YRBS survey data, and several school districts in California participate in that nationwide survey. And one of the statistics that we learned about LGB young people, lesbian, gay, and bisexual young people, is that just over 30% of them have attempted suicide. 30% of this population. Now, this is not because they identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. This is because they feel isolated, alone, misunderstood, or they have a tremendous amount of fear of someone learning about who they are and how they feel. Or they're not feeling that when they do come out that they're feeling supported by either their families, their peers, or their educators. And, you know, I wonder always why why that happens, why are schools maybe not doing more to address this. And then I look at my own experience. Now, my own experience as a child and being targeted and harassed as a gender nonconforming student, not ready to come out, not ready to disclose my sexual orientation, but being selected by my peers that you must be gay because I threw like a girl apparently, or I wasn't masculine enough according to my peers. And so I was labeled gay way before I was ready to come out, and that created really a disturbing set of years for me through my high school and middle school age. And I think about then when I went to college to get my teaching credential and my master's in school admin, my master's in school counseling, and even my doctorate in educational leadership. And the level of education that I was given and my peers were given as we were getting credentials and master's degrees to work with children, and it literally being a paragraph in one class in one chapter of a book. Now, I realize some universities are doing a much better job at that. I attended 4 different state universities in California, and that was my experience. And so if I can ask a few questions, and hopefully we'll kind of identify maybe why some of this is happening, continues to happen in 2017. So if you're able to raise your hand when I ask a question, please do so if it's true to you. How many in this room have had over an hour of mandated professional development provided by their school district on LGBT students? I see about 4 hands. How many in here would feel comfortable to be able to respond effectively in an age-appropriate way if you were in a second grade classroom and a student said something that was transphobic? Okay, maybe about 20% of the room. That's great. What happens when we don't make teachable moments? When something like that's said, right? It sends a message. It sends a really powerful message that this type of behavior is acceptable and okay. Kids pick up on that, and then it continues. And then the bias and the stigma perpetuates, and then kiddos have a really difficult time. I'd also like to just remind folks of California law and California Ed Code. LGBT identities are a protected class in California Ed Code and California law. Yet we treat the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender as bad words in K-12 public education. In fact, I was shushed in a staff lounge at a middle school once by a fellow colleague as we were talking about how best to support a student who identified as bisexual, claiming that that word was inappropriate for a middle school campus. So I share with you that my hope is, I guess, that many folks in here would think about how could we improve the cultural competency of our staff, of all staff, not just teachers, not just school counselors, but all staff, on what does it mean to be an LGBT-identified young person, and what kind of preventions and interventions can we put in place, not only to support those students who identify as LGBTQ, but also those students who have LGBT family members, parents, perhaps, but also for all of our students who are not LGBTQ. You know, we have an ethical obligation to prepare each student. Sometimes I hear all students, and I know historically, at least my understanding of history, all doesn't mean all, so I'm gonna say each student, that we have an obligation to each student to prepare them for the global and diverse world that we all live in today. And if we have students that we're graduating that are racist, that are sexist, that are xenophobic, that are homophobic, that are transphobic, et cetera, we're not preparing them to thrive in the global and diverse world that we live in today. In fact, corporate America will make a decision immediately if one of our students goes to work for them and brings those sets of values and beliefs to that workplace. They will be fired. So that's not preparing them for the global diverse world. So my hope is that we'll address bias across the board, that we'll feel more comfortable talking about differences in K-12 public education, and start early when bias is first formed, like in elementary school, and then from leadership down, empower educators to stand up and create safe and inclusive learning environments for each and every student. And that doesn't happen by itself. It takes action.
Sure.
Yeah.
Tough question for you, Vinny. California we have this reputation as a progressive, tolerant state. To what extent does that help the work that you're doing, or is it a notion that should be examined in a more nuanced way? Does the fact we're in California make your job easier?
Interesting. I think that progressive laws to protect LGBT students and LGBT staff in the state of California. However, I travel across this great state every week to work in K-12 public school districts. And I find that many of the most well-intentioned educators, from principals to school board members to superintendents, still don't fully understand what the law includes and still ask very basic questions. Like, we have a student who's transitioning in 2nd grade and we're not really sure what restroom to send her to. Like, those are, in my world, very, very basic questions. But when schools are responding after the fact, then they're not really preparing themselves on how to really create an inclusive environment for students who identify as LGBT. I also think in California, because there's such different communities where they're more progressive, more liberal, more open-minded, and then obviously ones that are on the opposite end of the spectrum, that folks are, primarily school leaders, SUPs, and school boards and school principals, are very fearful of parent pushback. And sometimes that parent pushback fear is so powerful that it's easier for them to just say, you know what, we're not going to address this right now. But not addressing that right now could be the result of a student that dies by suicide, or the result of students learning that being transphobic or homophobic or biphobic is okay, and then them getting fired later because they realize that's not acceptable in corporate America. Or worse, the LGBT student, drops out and says, I guess school's not for me because it's really not safe. So, and I can go on and on with other scenarios, but I do see that happening still in California. I still see school principals telling a transgender student that you're not allowed to use that restroom. That's still happening, regardless of the law.
Thank you. Russ, you've spent a lifetime studying and working to improve graduation rates. Are you throwing a celebration party these days as those rates have gone up? How do you see the challenge that we're facing? And obviously, kids who don't graduate are incredibly vulnerable in terms of our 21st century economy. But give us the latest on how, as a longtime warrior in this area, you are viewing our progress.
Thank you. There's kind of good news and bad news, I guess. So to answer your question, so I think the state has done a remarkable job overall in raising our graduation rates. We have now data for the last 7 years of individual level data that we can track individual students as they progress through our school system. And the numbers show that we've made progress. So we're roughly, in the last 7 years, we've gone up in graduation rates about 8.5% to roughly about 83.2%. So that's good news, I think, overall. And I think the more remarkable news in that respect is the gains that have been made by previously more disadvantaged groups. So if you look at racial disparities, for example, Hispanic rates have gone up higher than overall rates have, and well as other subgroups. So we've made progress not only overall, but by some of the more disadvantaged and vulnerable populations of students. We've seen increases really across the board. So I think, that's really the good news. The cautionary side of it is, a diploma is really a blunt instrument. It doesn't really tell us too much about what the students have actually learned and the skills that they've acquired. We have a set of requirements that the state sets and then districts set, academic requirements around coursework and credits. And that's really largely how we define a graduate in not only California, but the U.S. as a whole. But what we really are interested in is what kind of preparation have those students received? Because one of the things we know from the research is that high school is really a pivotal point in a child's life career, really. That is, what happens to that student in high school really defines their progress and their trajectory in life. And there have been some interesting studies that have tracked students from when they were, well, young people when they were students to when they become adults, and found that this high school period was really a pivotal period. And that's, Pedro, for example, made reference to the prison, education prison pipeline. So for the kids that are failing in high school, they have a very bleak future, as you mentioned, and they still do. Whereas the students that kind of thrive in high school, that earn credits and have a good pathway to college, do incredibly well. So high school is really still this pivotal point. So we've made this progress, yet we still, for example, have more than 50,000 students that are dropping out. So, maybe we've cut the actual number roughly by half, but we still got a lot of kids out there, and every life matters in that respect. And as I said, as a blunt instrument, it doesn't really tell us the learning behind it. So some of the concerns that not only I've raised, but other people have raised about things, for example, one of the mechanisms that districts have been using is credit recovery, where students who have failed a class can make it up. Well, the rigor of that kind of pathway or that course is questionable. I think there's some very good credit recovery programs out there. A lot of districts will contract with providers to do that. I've looked a little bit at LA's and some of the other ones. There's still a lot of discretion involved in what are the requirements to get a degree. So that's one issue about it. The second thing is that if we really want high school to prepare students for college and careers, then again, we need to drill down past just the diploma requirements itself, but what the learning is behind that. And we know, so for example, grades matter, both in terms of predicting college success and probably likely labor market success as well. So in other words, if a child can actually pass a class through a credit by getting a D, is there any learning associated with that? I would submit probably not. So we should really be looking at, well, what kind of grades do the students get to pass the course? And even the UC and CSU eligibility criteria that we do measure, so that also has shown improvement as well. More kids earning A to G credits. But we know from research that simply getting a 2.0 in a course really is maybe not sufficient. So getting kids to a threshold of a 2.0 on a A to G class may not be sufficient as well. So there's more things that we'd like to know and we need to know about the learning that's behind this improvement. And that's a little harder to do. I was talking to Mike Kirst earlier about it. I think we actually have a fair amount of data in California that would allow us to dig deeper a little bit in what the learning is behind some of the improvements that students make, and that's really what we want to know. So I know Pedro made this comment about graduation rates as well. So we're I'd say we're cautiously optimistic, that we're making improvements and that the improvements are real, but we got to dig down a little bit more in the data to know that that's really the case.
Are you encouraged by the changes, the proposed changes for the CSU system to get rid of placement tests and the fact that those tests seem to limit access to genuine college coursework? Are you encouraged by that?
Yeah, I mean, there's work being done on the idea of alternative ways of assessing readiness, right? And Long Beach, as you know, was one of the first places to do this. So I think we do have some evidence that these kind of hybrid courses in college that are kind of a combination of developmental built into the, students can take credit-bearing classes, college credit-bearing classes, but still get the supports they need to be successful. So I think we have some evidence that those are good. So I'm not a big fan of placement tests per se as the only mechanism with which students are placed. And so by using high school performance, because in general what we know is high school performance predicts college performance. And that's why high school grades are probably the single best indicator of how a student's going to do in college. So that's what the RP group, that does the community college research has found out, is that they can use grades, both overall GPA and subject-specific grades in English and math as the basis for placement, and they seem to do pretty well. So that is encouraging. But that gets back to my point that we have to see what kind of performance students are making in their high school courses to get a better indicator of how they'll do in college.
Last week, I was at an assessment meeting in New Hampshire, and as I was flying back, the state test scores had been released, and I'm reading all of these stories about the performance of our students, and I'm thinking, well, we're created a multiple measures accountability system, but it's clear in terms of the media that test scores are something that are very interesting to media and the public. So it's a long flight from Boston to LAX, and I'm reading all of these stories, and finally there's this breaking news. California will no longer allow gasoline in cars. And I thought to myself, wow, that's great cover for us in terms of let's get the focus off of these test scores and see if we can focus on something else like no gasoline in cars. So Kyla, as you think about this as a new superintendent, how do you frame the discussion in your district about a multiple measures accountability system, but also keep up the sense of urgency around getting at these issues of student performance as measured by tests?
So I think one of the benefits of Oakland being a part of CORE, and we've really developed a pretty robust data warehouse platform where we've been looking and breaking down data from an equity perspective for about 4 to 5 years. So we've been looking at data like suspensions, chronic absence, obviously English language learner performance, mathematics, but by gender, by race. We've been looking at the performance of English language learners, their proficiency in English, looking at long-term English language learners. We're now starting to think about, well, how do we track newcomers versus students who are move out of the English language learner category. So I'm saying all this because one of the things that we've been trying to stress to schools is, in addition to scoring proficiency, and that's absolutely key, that we ensure that more and more students are at grade level, but that we're also recognizing schools that are making tremendous growth. So if a student is coming into 9th grade at a 2nd grade reading level, that we're able to obviously make sure that there's still urgency, that the child leaves the 12th grade at 12th grade level, graduating and on track for college, but that might take a couple of years. So how we're tracking and celebrating the success along the way, which is important not just from kind of a psychological level for teachers and principals, but also for students, and to be able to track, are our interventions, are what we're focusing on in teacher meetings actually working. So being able to have data systems now from kindergarten through 12th grade, where we have for high schools early learning systems, we have for 8th grade being able to look at our kids ready and looking at metrics like the number of D's and F's students have, their chronic absence rate, so that before the kid gets into 9th grade, the 8th grade schools, the middle schools are able to communicate with high schools, and we're able to see kids in 9th grade and already be able to intervene. So we're now trying to figure out how to do that better, even in elementary schools. In Oakland, we have a gap where about 80% of your average white students are coming in kindergarten ready, 20 to 30% for Latino and Black students. So that really is the big challenge, is when we talk about the achievement gap, when we talk about the opportunity gap, that it starts before kindergarten. And so really being able to, we have a good foundation now, and it's really continuing to build that data muscle of our principals, of our teachers, and even parents, to really be able to look and see where individual kids are, and to really, again, communicate that absolutely our eye cannot stay off of getting all kids to proficiency, but we need to celebrate and we need to monitor and be able to see where are those schools within our system that are able to make major gains and get kids 2 to 3 grade levels of growth within a year. So I think that is the work moving forward. And as our schools become more and more diverse by ethnicity and also by language, we have more than 50 language spoken in Oakland, that we have to do a much better job of really tracking our English language proficiency In our LCAP, that is our area of focus. That is our area, given that we're close to 2/3 English language learners, where we're seeing that as the hugest gap, that academic language proficiency really being the barrier for subject matter proficiency, which then really affects our graduation rates. And the last thing I want to say about the graduation rates is one of the things that we're seeing with our increased newcomer population is while absolutely we've made some growth for graduation rates, and we've seen a lot of our students drop out less, and so they're staying in school longer. So we're seeing more kids, they may not be graduating within that 4-year cohort, but they may be taking the 5 years in order to graduate. So we may not see that result within our graduation rates, but we are seeing that decrease in the dropout rate. And so knowing that we need to do a better job creating some models, knowing our newcomer population is increasing, knowing we're keeping kids who might have dropped out before, so that even if they're not graduating in that 4-year time, that they are graduating within that 5-year period.
Go ahead, Russ.
I wanted to comment about your 5th and 6-year rates, because I think it is important that students, even if they're not going to make that cohort rate, which is the one that's advertised in the state counts, should really count. And I always make the analogy to higher education. As many of you know, in higher education we measure 4-, 5-, and 6-year graduation rates from colleges, and that's perfectly acceptable. And the NCAA uses the 6-year rate to judge how well the athletic programs are getting their students to graduate. But you know, in high schools we stick it with only the 4-year rate. And yet we can look at, and we do have data about 5th year and 6-year rates, and there are students that do that, and they should be, both the school should be applauded and the students should be applauded for doing that. If they come into high school behind grade level, as you mentioned, and takes 5 years to graduate, good for them. They did it, they persevered. So we really should actually expand our state data system to put those figures in there as well, and acknowledge the places like Oakland that are dealing with those kinds of students, to acknowledge and reward them for basically sticking with these kids and getting them to graduate in 5 or even 6 years.
Margie, you have a national perspective on these issues of immigration. Again, we sometimes feel we're special, we're California, we can better protect kids than other places can. Is that an accurate assessment, and are there other things that you've learned from other states that are helpful to vulnerable kids that California should be taking a look at?
Well, first of all, it's great to follow the last two comments with this. I would say you might be surprised to hear that a state like Texas, which is not nearly as known as California is for its investment in social services or its education system, actually, just as one, for example, has much better scores on the NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, for its 4th and 8th graders, even not looking at English language, but looking at math, that they're far ahead of most other states because of the investments that they've made in bilingual education in the early grades. And of course, California, for many years, was operating under an English-only proposition that prevented a lot of those kinds of programs from really flowering. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the LCCF in the context of what you're asking. We've done some work not just in the States, but also looking internationally, because there was a great interest, particularly in Germany, trying to think about how could they better support a lot of the immigrant and refugee children who were coming into the country in recent years. And we were part of an international team that looked in Germany, France, Canada, and the US. And in the US, we looked at a number of different states, comparing how they approach some of the funding issues, providing supplemental funds for English learners. And we were very excited, I would say, ultimately, with what California was doing with this local control funding formula, because Kyla just gave a great example that if maybe you were a school district that had long-term ELs that was mostly your experience working with long-term ELs, and then suddenly you had a lot of unaccompanied children come into your school, you would really need to be thinking in real time about what those students needed. That was different potentially, maybe in terms of socio-emotional supports, health and mental health, as well as different instructional methodologies, because many of them would have gaps in their underlying education, we found, et cetera, et cetera. And so having the flexibility to respond to different local needs is what most states and countries are actually looking for. And I would just, one of the concerns, or even I would say we're a little bit alarmed in terms of the implementation of LCCF in a state that is as forward-leaning as California, that what we've seen, and we've looked obviously at the research that Californians Together has done, putting together an expert panel to look at the local control accountability plans, that you do see in the state that there appears to be, as much as it's the right foundation and approach for the real-time thinking and development of strategies that districts need to do, that there simply isn't very often the level of expertise about what those various strategies are at the district level, for example, and that many of the reports were found, many of the local plans were found in that year 2 review to not even have taken account of the state ELD standards and the like, or the professional development that would be needed in order to implement them. And I would say that it's a particular concern now with the implementation of ESSA, because California has chosen, and I would say rightly so, it was unfair to schools that had large numbers of English learners and their teachers who were doing a heroic job, that we were never taking account in the subgroup accountability of how many students had been successful and exited the EL subgroup. But in adding them in now for accountability purposes, most of your schools are going to look much better in terms of how they're doing with ELs, when in fact not much may have changed. These students who have been reclassified will now be part of what you see on your dashboards and in terms of the EL subgroup. And so the fear is that that will mask what's really happening with your current EL students. And so I would say, you know, we're having to balance a lot of imperfect systems and measures. It's simply not possible to take account of everything when you're trying to make policy at a state level. But I would say that states like Illinois, Oregon, a number that have a true equity focus have thought, I would say, a little harder about how to take account of wanting to keep, for example, just that example, former Ls in the subgroup, but not have it cloud the public's view of what's really happening with current ELs. And so I do think that both on sort of the technical side of how to think about accountability for English learners, that there are some things out there from other states that could be helpful. I do think California is very much leaning in on a lot of the issues related to immigration enforcement at the state level. I think there is more that could be done, certainly. Not that other states are doing it, but I think around the country folks would expect that California would lead on this, that there could be more guidance for schools about how to think about, just for example, the data they may be unthinkingly collecting or asking from immigrant families on some of their forms, so that there could be better guidance and attention to those issues, and that just more generally in thinking about the professional capacity within a system to do the appropriate planning for services for ELs, that I would say that the state needs to take very seriously, that simply doesn't exist in many places, and that effective implementation of the new historic, epic even, LCCF approach really needs building out of that expertise at the district level, I would say, in order to make sure that you're really doing right by your EL students across the state.
One of the things we're doing at the Collaborative, one of our pilots, is with Local District Central in Los Angeles, and it's focused exclusively on best practice with regard to English learners. And so we're hopeful that we can learn some things there and spread it to the rest of the state. Vinny, a similar question to you. Are there other things that this bluest of blue states can learn from other places about the importance of treating students better?
Yeah, I think there are actually many school districts and school sites in particular within the state and even outside the state that I would call model schools and even model districts. And those are ones that actually take an active approach to addressing safety and inclusion across the board with basically an intersectional lens. So really looking across the board at difference, whether it be race, class, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. And that means that, for example, when the superintendent is talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that the superintendent is using examples and saying the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender as part of the overall work that the district is doing to change and shift and transform school culture and school climate. I guess I probably won't mention some of those districts in this. Come to the session that I'm doing and I'll talk a little bit more about theirs. There's my plug. But there's some really great, I think, methods happening where it's more student-led. And as much as I applaud our student leaders that are starting gay and straight alliances or GSA clubs or LGBT inclusive clubs on middle schools and high schools, that's typically driving the change that I'm seeing. And what I'd love to see a bigger shift is saying that actually the principal, the school board, the superintendent actually was saying this is a priority, that we take this serious, that this is part of what we do in this district. And yes, it will come with some parent pushback, community pushback, but we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. It's in alignment to our mission and vision statement. It's in alignment with California law and ed code. It's in alignment with which every major professional organization that touches upon K-12 education supports and actually has resolutions and resources to empower their members to actually take action in schools to create a sense of safety and inclusion and equity for each student. The other piece I'd say, the schools that I walk into, that I see that it's just a model, again, is that intersectional approach. That approach where a student comes to the school counselor and says, hey, I'm having this issue the last 2 days walking from third period to fourth period. And the school counselor knows that the student is transgender woman. But the student is explaining the challenges that she's experiencing between these periods walking to and from class from a peer where there's a teacher, for example, witnessing. And what the student explains is actually the student's experiencing xenophobia because the student was born outside of the United States. The student's an English language learner. The student lives under the poverty line. And the student is a transgender woman. And the student was experiencing xenophobia, sexism, racism, and transphobia all at the same time. And that counselor took that approach to say, we address the needs of our students looking at those multiple, vulnerable, marginalized identities and address it as such to support the full student and all of the identities that they bring. I think when we approach it like that, when we're really addressing diversity and inclusion and equity, and we're really looking at all of the identities that each and all of our students bring, whether they're invisible identities or not, because many of the identities our students bring with them we can't see. But they certainly know it and they feel it because they bring it with them. That we're addressing that, celebrating them, we're empowering them to bring those identities to the classroom, to the school hallways, to and from school, and we're creating a system and a culture where all of those identities are celebrated. They're seen as value. And any kind of stigma that's out there that's maybe touching upon one of these identities, that the school takes action to address it head on, from the top down, not just from the student groups up.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Russ a final question, and then I want those who have questions for our panelists to line up. Russ, it always creates cognitive dissonance in me whenever I find out that Chicago, New York, Texas are sometimes doing better than us on some things. And in my role as a member of the Spencer Foundation Board, which is headquartered in Chicago, I've found out some about what Chicago Public Schools and the Chicago Research Consortium are doing to focus in terms of the 9th grade, how students are prepared, tracking them and making sure that we get better outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about what Chicago is doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a long-standing partnership in Chicago that started, I think, 20 to 25 years ago. And the basic idea was to have a better relationship between the research community and the school district there. And there was even some activity that happened before that. But it is a real true partnership, and there's a lot of partnerships that have kind of sprung up other places since then, but that's really the first one. And the model that it uses is really to kind of be collaborators with the district and use data to shine light on both problems and solutions to the progress of their students. And ninth grade is one example. So the one piece of work that they've done that a lot of people are familiar with is create what they call an on-track indicator of kids who are likely to graduate and kids that were not likely to graduate. And it was relatively simple. You know, it was really based on credits earned and the number of failed classes that students had in ninth grade. And they found that the students that were on track based on this indicator, and at the time there was about 60% of the students that were on track, were quite likely to graduate. And the overall graduation rate, by the way, in Chicago was pretty low at the time. And the students that were not on track, you know, had a very high rate of not graduating from high school. And they use that as a basis to put in a series of interventions, you know, like double period math and things like that in ninth grade. So they used it as a mechanism to invest in certain kind of intervention strategies. The latest one that they've come out with, that some of you may have seen, is really about ninth grade GPA. It gets back to what I was talking about as GPA being such a strong indicator of performance. So they found that ninth grade GPA was actually predictive of how students were going to do in college, not only how they would do in subsequent years of high school. So this is, again, what I was talking to Mike about, Kirst about earlier, that we actually have the data in California to do a kind of replication of some of the work that Chicago's doing, but do it statewide as opposed to district only. You know, that we collect data through our CalPads system. You know, many of you in districts, of course, have to report these data on both the courses that students take, literally every course that students take in our state, and the grades that they receive for doing that. So we could do some things like that at a state level. And some districts are already, of course, have quite advanced data systems to do this stuff. The core districts are doing a lot of really good work around these data. But there are a lot of places in the state, you probably know this, Carl, from other districts that don't have that kind of capacity. So even though kind of large-scale partnerships like the Chicago example and CORE is a really nice, another example of a really nice partnership, you know, with PACE and Stanford doing all this work. There's lots of places in the state that don't have capacity, which is kind of what your work is focusing on. And I think the data in California would lend themselves to some of that kind of analysis. So hopefully we can work on that as a way and learn a lot, as we have from Chicago, because they put out this work for a long time.
Thank you. First question back there.
Thank you. My name is Carrie Dubois. I'm a trustee for the Sequoia Union High School District. My question is for Russ. I like what you said about giving kids who are very behind, if they're coming into high school at the second or third reading level, they need more time, possibly a fifth or a sixth year. My question for you is, in my district, kids are moved off to a continuation high school their junior year. And by that time, their attendance is bad, they're so disconnected from school. And so I've been arguing that maybe we need an alternative placement for very at-risk ninth graders, but there's pushback for that. We want to be inclusive, we want to give kids a chance. What are your thoughts? Is it better to move kids to an alternative setting earlier, or should we just really try to keep them in the comprehensive high school setting? The truth is, for our very, very at-risk kids, sometimes they just don't do well in the comprehensive high school setting. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think many people, me included, I guess, view the comprehensive high school as, I wouldn't say a relic, but as a type of high school that serves a lot of students well, but not all students well. So there are a lot of alternative models out there of different kinds of school pathways. So we've really created a lot more options at the high school level for kids. And of course, some of those options are ones that advantaged kids take advantage of, you know, like dual enrollment and things like that. So we've kind of, to some extent, spread out the options and therefore the opportunity structure from, you know, more narrowly, like everybody went to a comprehensive high school, to now these alternative things. So we have early college high schools, for example, things like that. So I would say in I'm probably a supporter of setting up these alternatives earlier, but meaningful alternatives. So, you know, Pedro showcased a couple of kind of model schools. So if students can go into a kind of a very supportive, positive learning environment as a ninth grader is an alternative setting, I would be in support of that. But traditionally, we know that alternative schools are not that, you know, continuation high schools in particular. So that was one of the first studies we did at the California Dropout Research Project, was seeing how many of the dropouts actually came out of alternative schools. But most typically, they don't start out there, right? They end up there. So it's really kind of a later placement, and it's not a meaningful placement. So I think the traditional alternative schools are not a good place to go, but meaningful, I'll call them meaningful alternative schools, would be, and I think they could start and probably should start as early as ninth grade.
Okay, it looks like we have time for one more question unless someone gives us more time. Go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Claudia Quesada. I work at Cal State University East Bay. We're a Hispanic serving institution. I'm really happy that Dr. Kirst is going to be recognized today because I reference a lot of his work in my dissertation. And shifting the focus of remediation, the focus should not be students or the cause of remediation, but rather there's secondary and post-secondary factors. We know that students are placed in there because of outdated matriculation and placement processes and policies. I think California is on the right track with multiple measures. My question to Russell is, how do we step towards becoming a little more like Tennessee that has all three segments are multiple measures and co-requisite, the University of Tennessee, State of Tennessee, community colleges in Tennessee. We've only started doing that in California in bits and measures. It's not the entire state. And the second question is, when we do deliver co-requisite courses to students, for example, in my campus, it would be Latino students. The 18 other campuses and CSUs are also Hispanics serving campuses. How are we not delivering disparate co-requisite courses? Some students that are in STEM are going to get faculty that's tenured, and the non-STEM math students and co-requisite might get graduate students delivering that. Could you speak towards that? Sorry. It's a lot, but I've been waiting.
It's a lot, yeah. Well, let's just say that our higher ed system, you know, is the three public segments, and the challenge has always been, you know, to coordinate across those segments, and we generally don't do a very good job, and I know Professor Kirst has written about this himself. So, you know, we're starting at the community college level doing that, and I think it's a good place to start in terms of what the alternative ways of placement are going to be. But, you know, I worked at UC President's Office for a while, so getting UC on board would be harder, but I think there's less of a problem there. I think the place where it hasn't been done as much, as far as I know, is at the CSU level, where you are. And I think that's one of the challenges moving forward. But ideally, we should move in the direction of having more coordination among our higher ed segments that we, you know, typically haven't had, and that's really a challenge. But I think we can't. Mike might want to talk about this in his remarks about where we might go from there. But I think the work that's already being done at the community college is really putting us in the right direction. And as I said, the CSUs are maybe the next place to do it.
Thank you.
Okay, please thank our panel for joining us.